The narrator lives on Long Island, New York. He is dating a girl named Kaylee. Their relationship is still pretty new, but Kaylee wants him to meet her family for the holidays up in Vermont. He is excited but nervous. Kaylee tells him it is a very small family gathering, just her, her brother, and her parents. They pack up his truck and head north, watching the snow pile up as they cross the state line. They pull up to the house. It is a beautiful property, deeply secluded in the woods with no neighbors. As they get out of his truck, Kaylee's parents walk out onto the porch. The father shakes his hand, pats him on the back, and says it is great to meet him, but he does not smile. The mother hugs him with a lot of energy, but she has an incredibly wide, exaggerated smile that feels very forced. It feels like she is wearing a mask. Inside, the house is cozy. A little while later, Kaylee's brother Paul arrives. Paul is a very socially awkward guy with a bowl cut and a full tattoo sleeve. They sit down for dinner. The conversation is stiff. Paul keeps staring at the narrator. At one point, the narrator looks directly back at Paul. They lock eyes for 3 long seconds before Paul slowly turns his head back to the television. It is a cold, judgmental look that makes the narrator feel very uncomfortable. After dinner, they watch a movie. Finally, it is time for bed. The narrator and Kaylee are staying in the guest bedroom, which has an attached bathroom. Kaylee goes into the bathroom, leaving her phone on the nightstand. While she is in there, the phone lights up with a text from her mother. It says, "Do you think he suspects anything yet?" Before he can process this, the screen locks and the notification hides. The narrator stands there, frozen, his heart hammering. What does that mean? Kaylee comes out of the bathroom. The narrator tries to act normal, but he is clearly shaken. Kaylee notices his quietness and spends a few minutes texting on her phone before turning off the lamp. They lie in the dark. The narrator cannot sleep, his mind racing with terrifying possibilities. Then, at exactly 2:00 in the morning, the narrator feels the mattress shift. Kaylee is slipping out of bed. She is doing it incredibly quietly, trying not to wake him. Under the circumstances, it feels highly suspicious. The narrator pretends to be asleep. He can feel Kaylee standing right next to his side of the bed, just staring down at him in the pitch black. After a few agonizing moments, she quietly walks out of the room and heads downstairs. A moment later, the narrator hears the floorboards creak. Another person is walking downstairs. Then a third person. The whole family is gathering in the dark. The narrator quietly slips out of bed and creeps toward the top of the stairs to listen to what is going on. He can hear low, hushed whispering coming from the dining room near the base of the staircase. They are speaking in quiet tones, planning something. The narrator leans closer, trying to make out the words. He hears Kaylee whisper, "When I go back up, you stand by the door." Terror washes over him. He does not know what they are planning to do to him, but he knows he has to get out of this house immediately. He quietly runs back into the guest room to grab his clothes and his truck keys. He reaches for his keys on the nightstand, and as he does, he senses a shadow in the corner of the room. He reaches out and flips on the bedside lamp. The light floods the room, and the narrator stops breathing. Sitting in a wooden chair in the far corner of the dark bedroom is Kaylee's father. He is just sitting there in the dark, wearing his glasses, staring directly at the narrator with a completely blank, expressionless face. He had been sitting there in the dark the entire time, watching him. The narrator loses his mind. He screams at the top of his lungs, "You are all crazy." He runs out of the room, bolts down the stairs past the startled family, throws open the front door and runs to his truck. He starts the engine and floors it down the long, snowy driveway without looking back. He drives for hours, not stopping until he needs gas. When he finally checks his phone, he sees a text from Kaylee asking what happened. He replies, telling her to never contact him again. She never replies. Our second story takes us to another cold December night, but this time, the threat did not come from an unsettling family. It came from the dark, snowy woods outside a peaceful home. The narrator of this story was 16 years old. It was Christmas Eve night, around 1:00 in the morning. The rest of his family was fast asleep, but he loved to stay up extra late on Christmas Eve. He was sitting in the den, watching a movie, enjoying the quiet, cozy holiday atmosphere. Outside, a heavy snowstorm was blanketing the neighborhood. To make the room feel even more festive, he had left one of the den windows cracked open a few inches. He also kept the backyard floodlight on to watch the snow fall. As he sat on the couch, something caught his eye. Out of his peripheral vision, he thought he saw a dark shape move across the yard. He quickly turned his head and stared out the window, but there was nothing there, just the falling snow. Still, a strange feeling of unease washed over him. He got up, walked over to the window, and squinted into the darkness. Everything seemed quiet, so he decided he was just letting his imagination get the best of him. He sat back down on the couch and tried to focus on his movie, but the peaceful feeling was gone. He kept glancing back at the window every few minutes. About 10 minutes passed, and he was finally starting to calm down. But then, a loud, sharp noise shattered the silence of the night. It was the unmistakable sound of the heavy wooden backyard gate slamming shut. The narrator froze. Someone was definitely out there. Trembling, he quickly slipped on his boots and a warm jacket. He stepped out onto the back porch into the freezing air. The snow was falling heavily now, but the floodlight illuminated the yard clearly. There, cutting directly across the pristine, untouched snow, was a fresh set of footprints. They led from the side gate, right across the middle of the yard, and ended at the other gate. The footprints were large, clearly made by heavy boots. Seeing the physical proof that a stranger was sneaking around made his stomach drop. He realized he was completely alone out here in the dark, and he did not feel brave enough to follow the tracks. He quickly turned around and went back inside the house. He locked the door behind him and stood in the warm hallway, trying to catch his breath. As he began to unzip his jacket and pull off his boots, he looked down at the floor. His heart stopped. There, on the clean carpet of the den, was a trail of wet, muddy boot prints. They did not belong to him. They were fresh, and they led directly into the house. The prints led from the home office, down the long hallway, towards the living room and his parents' bedroom. The stranger had already made it inside. The narrator knew he had to figure out how the person had entered. He decided to check the home office first. He kept the lights off, moving as quietly as possible through the shadows so he would not alert the intruder to his presence. He walked into the dark office, expecting to find a shattered window pane or a forced lock. But as he looked around, all the windows were intact. He stood there, confused and terrified. Then the realization hit him. The muddy footprints on the floor did not start in the office. They ended there. The intruder was still in the room. The narrator slowly lifted his eyes toward the far corner of the office, where a heavy wooden door led into the attached garage. The door was hanging wide open. Standing right in the dark doorway of the garage was a figure. It was a person wearing a bulky winter coat, blue jeans, and heavy boots. The person was squatting down low, trying to hide. The intruder was crouching in the shadows of the garage. Their back was facing the office, but their head was twisted completely around, staring directly at the narrator. For a few agonizing seconds, neither of them moved. The narrator stood paralyzed with fear, staring into the eyes of the stranger. Then, adrenaline kicked in. The narrator turned and ran as fast as he could down the hallway, screaming for his parents at the top of his lungs. He pounded on his parents' bedroom door, yelling that someone was in the house. His father woke up instantly, grabbed a flashlight, and ran out into the hallway with him. They bolted back toward the office and the garage. As they approached the office, they heard the loud mechanical rumble of the main garage door opening. By the time they reached the garage, the space was empty. The cold winter wind was howling through the open garage door, and the intruder was gone, lost in the dark snowstorm. The family later discovered that the intruder had entered the house through an unlocked window in the living room. For our final story, we look at a bizarre and violent crime that turned a festive community gathering into an absolute nightmare. The narrator of this story was 16 years old, the oldest of 4 siblings. His parents belonged to an exclusive social club in their town. Every year in December, the club hosted a grand Christmas party at a local firehouse. For the younger children, the highlight of the night was always the arrival of Santa Claus, who would hand out presents. This year, the club had asked the narrator's father's best friend, a man named Michael, to play the role of Santa. Michael was sitting at the table with the family, enjoying his dinner. When the time came, Michael quietly stood up and went to change. Suddenly, the doors of the firehouse opened, and a man dressed as Santa walked in, carrying a large sack of presents. But the narrator immediately noticed something was wrong. The costume looked incredibly cheap, like a last-minute outfit. The beard was crooked, and the voice sounded strange. The man in the cheap suit grabbed the heavy sack of gifts and announced he had to run back outside to fetch the rest of the presents, quickly walking back out the front doors. That was when the narrator's father realized that was not Michael. They ran out after him, but the fake Santa was gone, and Michael's luxury car was missing from its spot. They tried calling Michael's phone, but there was no answer. Later, they heard a faint cry for help coming from the deep woods. The narrator ran in and found Michael tied to a tree, beaten and bloody. He had been ambushed by 3 masked men who stole his car and the children's gifts. It was a sickening plan that turned the night to tragedy. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. We often think of our lives as being divided into safe zones. There are the places we go where we feel absolutely secure, like our old schools, our friends' houses, and especially our own homes. We go about our daily routines thinking that nothing could ever pierce that bubble of safety. But the truth is, the world is much more unpredictable, and sometimes much darker than we like to admit. The places we trust the most can easily become the settings for our worst nightmares. Sometimes the threats are hidden right beneath our feet, waiting in the dark corners we choose to ignore. Other times they follow us from hundreds of miles away, driven by an obsession we did not even know existed. And in the worst cases, the danger climbs right through our windows, standing in the hallway of our homes while our families sleep. Think about it. When you walk into your local school, or when you gather in your backyard with your friends for a weekend party, or when you tuck your children into bed at night, you are operating on a fundamental assumption. You assume that the doors are locked, that the walls are solid, and that the people around you have good intentions. We have to believe this just to get through the day without being consumed by paranoia. But what happens when that assumption is completely shattered? What happens when you realize that the barrier between you and absolute terror is incredibly thin? The 3 stories we are looking at today are real accounts from people who had their sense of safety violently ripped away. They are stories of hidden dangers, obsessive stalking, and terrifying home invasions that will make you double-check your locks tonight. Let us start with a story from a small town back when high school was a completely different experience. When I was in high school, I was what you would call a nerd. Back then, it was not a term of endearment like it can be today. I hear people all the time now wear that word like a badge of honor. For my friends and me, it was like getting hit in the stomach repeatedly. High school was just different then. We would get beaten up for not liking the same music or not being into sports. It seems cliché, but it is the absolute truth. Junior year was the worst year for all the bullying. This kid Steve tormented us all year. He was bigger than us, louder than us, and he made it his personal mission to make our lives miserable. He would trip us in the cafeteria, knock our books out of our hands in the hallway, and laugh with his friends while we scrambled to pick them up off the dirty floor. Towards the end of the school year, Steve thought it would be a good idea to break into the school to play one of his stupid pranks, just because he wanted to prove to everyone how cool he was. Well, Steve was so cool that he ended up getting caught. But before I continue with what happened to him, I should lay a little bit of groundwork first. My school is now closed, but back then it was one of the more popular private schools in this area. We had to wear strict uniforms and go to regular church services during school hours. The school building itself was incredibly old. Before being converted into a school back in the 1950s, it was some sort of hospital for the sick. I remember hearing that when they built the school in the 50s and tore up some of the ground, they found a ton of skeletal remains from people who had passed away from tuberculosis, among other things. Because people did not want to get sick from the bodies, they would just dispose of them in this underground tunnel that used to connect the hospital with another building. These stories, whether they were true or not, became the stuff of legend around my hometown, especially for students of the school. In other words, they were almost passed down like urban legends from one graduating class to the next. The seniors would tell the freshmen about the tunnels, describing how the walls were still stained, and how the spirits of the dead still wandered the hallways at night. The school, being so old and looking old, I might add, was just an objectively scary place sometimes. Rumors started to swirl around that the school was haunted, like souls not resting properly, and all that fun stuff. You would constantly hear strange noises all the time with no explanation. Creaking floorboards, heavy thuds, and pipes whistling through the walls. It was just your typical school spirit response to say, yes, those noises must just be the ghosts. However, the more logical answer is that the school just made a lot of noise, because the building was old and falling apart. But back to Steve. The reason why Steve wanted to break in was that he wanted to pull this highly elaborate prank. He successfully broke in over the weekend, climbing through a window that had been left unlatched in the back. Once inside, he started ripping classrooms apart, throwing papers everywhere, tipping over teachers' desks, and even went to the library and pulled tons of books off the shelves, leaving them scattered in piles on the floor. You are probably wondering how Steve got caught. Well, to cap off his ghostly prank, he went to the art room, stole red paint, and started writing a message across the lockers. Your typical horror movie tropes. He wrote things like, "Get out," "Your soul is next," and my personal favorite, "Death is coming." While he was writing on these lockers, Steve claimed that he heard something coming from the basement. According to Steve, he went to the basement door, and before going downstairs, he saw shadows moving and heard voices talking from the darkness below. He said it sounded evil and not just like normal whispers. It scared him so badly that he dropped his paintbrush, ran out of the school, and left his paint cans behind. It did not take long for the administration to match his handwriting with that of the red paint on the lockers. My school had enough of Steve's nonsense, and they expelled him that week following the investigation. I will never forget Steve screaming as he was leaving the principal's office, screaming about something evil in the basement. His words, not mine. He was crying, his face red, pointing his finger toward the floor, yelling that there was something alive down there. I was confident that Steve was making it up, doing anything he could to save himself from getting in trouble. Everyone was so sad about Steve, except for my few friends and myself, who absolutely hated the kid. In our opinion, he got exactly what he deserved. For the last few weeks of school, we had to listen to everyone talk about how brave he was and how he could have died. Yeah, I am not even kidding. These fools really thought that Steve was in danger from evil spirits. As school was wrapping up for the year, I suggested something crazy to my friends. On the last day of school, we should break into the school and do what Steve could not. We could prove that there are no evil spirits, no ghosts, and most importantly, that Steve was a lying punk. My friends agreed. The plan was just to break in quietly, make our way to the basement, prove that it is just a basement, and then leave. If we heard anything, we run. We do not get caught, as Steve did. We thought that if we ran and did not get caught, nobody would suspect us, because we were the nerds, the teachers' pets, the fools that actually liked to learn. We were not the type of kids to do something like this, especially after someone got caught. I remember the night vividly. It was cold for an early summer night. We all had sweatpants and jackets on. We really embraced the whole criminal breaking in identity. We had our hoods up and tried our best to be sneaky. Breaking in was not exactly hard for us. Not because we are these master criminals, but because my friend Carson's mom was a janitor for the school and had access to a key, half the reason we decided to do this. Carson swiped the key from her kitchen counter, where she kept her work items, and we just walked through the back door of the school. I will admit it was objectively unsettling in there. Anyone who has been in their school after dark knows the feeling of being somewhere you are not supposed to be. I do not know if we are hardwired that way, but there is just something about being in the school after dark that is unnerving for us. Maybe it was just the years of hearing about all the ghosts. I sort of figured I was subconsciously fearing evil ghosts. Urban legends are a powerful thing. We eventually got to the basement door, and I have to admit I was feeling something. I do not know about my friends, but I was actually kind of scared. I did not tell them that, because I did not want them to make fun of me. My logic in that moment was that I was here, and I am going through with this. We opened the heavy wooden door to the basement, and the first thing that hit us was the absolute darkness. It was not just dark, it was the kind of heavy, thick blackness that felt like it was pressing against your chest. A cool, damp draft of air blew up from the stairs, bringing with it the smell of old concrete, dust, and something else that I could not quite identify, something sweet and metallic. It was a dark staircase that led to an even darker basement. Carson led the way, taking the first step down, and the wooden stair groaned loudly under his weight. We froze, holding our breath, waiting to see if anyone had heard us. But there was only silence. We followed him down, one by one. Cell phones were not exactly popular yet, and they most definitely did not have flashlights on them yet. So we were using straight-up dollar store flashlights. These were the cheap yellow plastic ones that you had to shake occasionally just to keep the weak bulb from flickering out. As we made our way downstairs, the basement was creepy, obviously. It was a massive, cavernous space that felt more like a dungeon than a school basement. It was an old building with a dusty basement, and the walls were made of rough, unfinished stone. There were boxes of storage everywhere, stacked high like a maze. We looked through a few as we walked through the basement, our flashlight beams darting across the cardboard boxes. It was old textbooks with faded covers, dusty Christmas decorations, and extra school uniforms that had probably been sitting there for decades. Probably the creepiest thing about the basement for me was all the old religious statues. Our school was private, and they had stored all these old, chipped plaster statues of saints and religious figures down here. I am weird, but for some reason old religious statues scare me. They are just unsettling to me, with their unblinking glass eyes and pale, painted faces that look like they are watching you in the dark. It is the same reason why old churches freak me out. We continued exploring the basement for a few more minutes, our footsteps echoing softly on the cold concrete floor. We did not find any people, but we did find out how massively huge the basement was. It felt like it extended forever into the darkness under the school. Our flashlights were not even powerful enough to see the end of the basement from where we were standing. I know they were cheap flashlights, but still, the absolute vastness of the space was terrifying. Eventually, we made our way to one of the furthest corners of the basement. It felt colder for some reason, a deep chill that seemed to seep right through our jackets. We moved some of the heavy cardboard boxes of old textbooks out of the way, and we could not believe our eyes. There was a small hole in the stone wall, near the floor. I would say probably the size of a large beach ball. It was small, but large enough for a person to crawl through if they squeezed. Carson wanted to check it out, but my other friend and I were completely against it. It felt wrong, and the air coming out of that hole smelled incredibly bad. Instead of crawling in, we shone the flashlight through the hole. It was just dark inside. It looked like a tunnel, constructed of old, damp brick. We all had the same idea at that exact moment. This was probably the remains of the old underground tunnel, where they had stored all the bodies of the tuberculosis victims back in the day. There are some secrets that you try to bury deep down in your mind, hoping they will just fade away with time. For me, this secret started when I was a sophomore at a university in the Northeast. I will not say which school it was, but I was a member of the Kappa sorority. I was an English major, and I always took my academics very seriously, because my ultimate goal was to get into law school after graduation. This is an important piece of context because it explains why I was so focused, and why I ended up in the class where everything began. Last semester, I signed up for an upper-level course on English Romanticism. The class was quite small, with only about 25 students in total. It was mostly made up of juniors and seniors, so I was one of the younger students there. There was a professor who technically led the seminars, but most of the actual teaching and discussion was run by the graduate teaching assistant. His name was Rohr. Yes, that was his real name. I still do not know if Rohr was his first name or his last name, but that was what everyone called him. Rohr was in his late 20s, kind of lanky, and he gave off this very specific energy of being in a band, but not a very good one. He was just an oddball overall. Anyway, the class itself was fine. We did a lot of close reading and had long discussions about nature, memory, and all of that romantic nonsense, but the actual student participation was pretty dead most days. People would just sit there in silence, waiting for Rohr to fill the quiet space, which he absolutely hated. You could tell that the dead silence made him incredibly uncomfortable. And that was a big problem, because when the silence went on too long, Rohr would start cold calling on people. He would chirp at them and make passive-aggressive comments when they clearly did not know what was going on, because they had not done the reading. But there was one guy in the class who always seemed to keep things alive. His name was Luke. He was tall with brown hair, and the only other thing I really knew about him at the start was that he was in one of the better, more popular fraternities on campus. Luke had this unique way of making jokes at just the right moment. He was not trying to be annoying or disruptive, but he knew exactly how to break the awkward tension when things got uncomfortable. And the best part was that he actually did the reading, which was incredibly rare for most of the guys in that class. When Luke talked, it was very clear that he knew his stuff, so his humor felt earned. He was not just trying to be the class clown. He genuinely had a great presence. I remember thinking to myself that he was smart, but also kind of goofy now. Since I needed to keep my participation grades high for my GPA, I ended up being one of the only other people in the room who talked on a regular basis. So, on any given day, it was usually just me, Luke, and maybe 2 or 3 other students carrying the entire discussion while everyone else completely zoned out. Roar seemed to really appreciate our effort. He would nod along whenever I made a point, and sometimes he would build on what I said in a way that felt highly validating. For my first major essay, and I still remember this vividly, I wrote about ambiguity in Wordsworth's poem, Tintern Abbey. It was not exactly groundbreaking literary analysis, but I was really proud of the work I had put into it. When I got the paper back, Roar had written these incredibly long, highly detailed comments in the margins. They were not just grammar corrections or simple grading notes. They were actual paragraphs of agreement with my ideas, almost like he was having a conversation with me through the paper. But after that, I noticed that things started to shift a bit. Roar began paying a lot more attention to me during class. He would call on me more often than anyone else, ask deep follow-up questions to my answers, and make eye contact with me for uncomfortably long periods of time. At first, I tried to convince myself that I was just imagining things. College teaching assistants take a liking to certain students all the time, and it is not that unusual to be a favorite student when you are one of the few people actually participating. But then he started asking me things after class that felt less and less academic. He would ask about my weekend plans, or what I liked to do outside of school. I brushed it off, though. I had a lot of other things going on in my life, and I did not want to make a big deal out of nothing. Around that same time, I started running into Luke more and more outside of the classroom. Our sorority and his fraternity had a lot of social overlap. Personally, I think a lot of Greek life can be pretty stupid, but we were both members of what people considered the top houses on campus. Because of that, we had a lot of joint mixers, date nights, and we just ended up going to the same parties. It felt like Luke was always there, wherever I went. So naturally, we started talking more and more, and I really began to develop a liking for him. After a few weeks of this casual flirting, Luke asked me if I wanted to grab dinner with him sometime, and I said yes. We went on maybe 3 dates before things started to progress. Luke was incredibly sweet, very attentive, and he had all of the qualities you would want in a guy you are dating. We eventually started sleeping together, and everything felt completely normal. I was not head over heels in love or anything, but I genuinely liked him. The relationship was uncomplicated, low maintenance, and mostly painless. Or so I thought. One afternoon after our English seminar had ended, I was walking out to my car when I spotted Luke standing behind the lecture hall. He was smoking a cigarette, and he was standing there with Roar, our teaching assistant. They were talking and laughing like they had known each other for years, which struck me as very weird. For one thing, I did not even know that Luke smoked. When I asked him about it later that night, he laughed it off. He told me that he was just trying to get on Roar's good side, so he would not have to try as hard toward the end of the semester when final grades were due. I told him that was kind of pathetic, but he just laughed again and said he would gladly take being pathetic over getting a bad grade any day of the week. A few weeks later, we were hanging out at his place. He had fallen asleep, and when I came back into the bedroom, I noticed that his phone was lying next to him on the bed with a YouTube video playing. Now I know that I should not have looked, but curiosity got the absolute better of me. Can you really blame me, though? I was a college girl in a sorority, and the types of guys I was constantly surrounded by would cause any rational person to develop serious trust issues. So I picked up his phone and began going through it. I am still not entirely sure what I was expecting to find. Maybe some texts with other girls, or some typical fraternity group chat nonsense. but I was definitely not expecting to find a massive collection of photos of myself. And when I say a collection, I mean there were a lot of them. Some of the photos were relatively benign, like pictures of me just going about my day, studying in the library, or walking to class. But there were others. I will let you fill in the blanks yourself. But they were, let us just say, highly suggestive. Some of them were photos that I had willingly sent him myself. But there were quite a few others that I had absolutely no recollection of ever taking, let alone sending to him. At that exact moment, I was not even angry. I was mostly just deeply creeped out. It was a bizarre feeling because if he had simply asked me to take those photos, I probably would not have been opposed to it at all. But the fact that they were taken without my knowledge felt incredibly violating. Still, I did not wake him up that night. I just put the phone down, went back to sleep, and spent the next morning not really knowing how to feel. I ended up keeping the whole thing to myself for a while. Part of the reason was that I was embarrassed, but another part was that I did not want him to know that I had been snooping through his phone while he was asleep. But a week later, after he had fallen asleep again, the anxiety became too much to bear. I decided to try guessing his passcode. It actually was not very hard to figure out. It was just his birthday, but typed in reverse. Once the phone unlocked, I decided to go much deeper this time. And you should brace yourself, because things began to move incredibly fast from this exact point forward. I checked his messages, his deleted photos, his hidden folders, everything. And that was when I found something truly horrifying. Luke had been sending those private photos of me to an unsaved phone number. He had been doing this regularly for weeks. Basically, for the entire duration of the time we had been seeing each other. It was sick, and I knew deep down that it was probably highly illegal too. But I could not even think about the legal side of it in that moment. My entire body was shaking, and the adrenaline was rushing through my veins. I took out my own phone and quickly took pictures of his screen to document everything. And then, the reality of it hit me, and I started to cry. I could not control myself. The tears were just streaming down my face. In a fit of pure panic and anger, I basically slapped Luke awake and demanded to know who that unsaved number belonged to. He sat up, completely disoriented, and immediately stumbled through this ridiculous, convoluted story. He claimed that the unsaved number was just his own backup phone, and that he liked to keep copies of all his files and photos on a separate device in case his main phone ever got lost or broken. I knew instantly that he was lying to my face. The sheer panic in his eyes gave him away. I did not want to hear another word of his excuses, so I packed my things and stormed out of his apartment before he could try to convince me to stay. I was a complete wreck. My mind was spinning. I was a psychological mess, and I felt incredibly gross. I really do not want to get into the immediate aftermath of everything that happened next, so I won't. Just know that the following week was easily the worst, most painful week of my entire life. The last thing I need right now is for that trauma to be reopened if anyone at my school figures out who I am, which is another reason why I am keeping these specific details to an absolute minimum. But here is what eventually came to light. The unknown, unsaved number on Luke's phone ended up belonging to Roar, my English teaching assistant. The police got involved very quickly, and once the detectives started pressing Luke in an interrogation room, he cracked and confessed to everything. He admitted to the officers that Roar had been paying him hundreds of dollars in cash, apparently in exchange for private suggestive photos of me. This entire sick arrangement had been going on since the very beginning of the semester, and possibly even longer. I do not know all of the dark details, and honestly, I do not want to know them. As a result of the investigation, Luke was immediately expelled from the university, and Roar was fired from his position. I am also pretty sure there was some actual jail time involved for both of them, although I do remember thinking at the time that whatever punishment they received was not nearly enough to make me feel safe or compensated for what they had done to me. That whole nightmare happened over 1.5 years ago. I am a senior now, and I am almost completely done with school. To be perfectly honest, I am incredibly relieved that graduation is just around the corner. I have dealt with the trauma in my own ways, and I will not get into that, but for a long time, I genuinely thought that everything was finally behind me. But a few weeks ago, I started noticing something strange. There is this specific silver sedan that has been parked directly outside my sorority house late at night. It is not there every single night, but it has appeared often enough that I have started paying very close attention to it. I have spent hours watching it from my window, but I have never seen anyone actually get in or out of the car. I do not know if it is one of them. I tell myself that I am probably just being paranoid, but the sight of that car is really freaking me out. And honestly, I am not even sure how either of them would know that I live in this house now. I moved into this specific sorority house well after the situation with Luke had ended. Anyway, if anything else happens, I will definitely provide an update. Now, while some predators wait in the shadows of academic institutions, others find a way directly into the place where you are supposed to feel the safest. Your own bedroom. My name is Mike, but everyone calls me Mikey. I am 22 years old, and I am still living with my parents in Northern California. And before you ask, no, it is not the typical California that you are probably picturing in your head right now. I always find myself having to explain this to people who do not live here. Not every single part of the state is filled with sunny beaches and tall palm trees. Where I live, it snows pretty heavily during the winter. We are talking about the middle of nowhere, completely surrounded by dense forest. The closest neighbor is a 10-minute drive away, just to give you an idea of how isolated we are. I have been skiing my entire life, so the freezing cold does not really bother me at all. If anything, I actually prefer the cold weather, but that is not really the point of what I am trying to tell you. The point is that 2 weekends ago, my parents flew out of the country to attend a wedding. One of my mom's old friends was getting married in Portugal. I was not invited to the wedding, but I did not really care about that. Having a quiet weekend completely alone in the house sounded like a really nice break. Our house is not anything special. It is just your standard 3-bedroom, 1-story home with nothing fancy about it. My parents' bedroom is located at one far end of the hallway. My room is at the opposite end of that same hall, and there is a guest bedroom sitting right in between them that we mostly just use for extra storage. The living room and the kitchen are located right in the middle of the house, and the front door opens directly into the living room. I am describing this specific layout because it will become incredibly important for what happened next. The first night alone in the house was completely fine. I stayed up late, went to bed around 2 o'clock in the morning, and passed out pretty quickly. But the second night is when everything went horribly wrong. I went to bed around the exact same time, maybe even a little bit earlier. I remember feeling much more tired than usual that night, so I knocked out almost instantly. I do not know what exact time it was when I woke up, but it was definitely the middle of the night. Waking up like that is very irregular for me, as I am usually a very heavy sleeper. I knew instantly that something specific must have woken me up. I always make a point to keep my phone on airplane mode when I sleep, so I knew it was not a text message or a phone notification that had disturbed me. It was something else entirely, but in those first few seconds, I had no idea what it could have been. I scanned the room, trying to see if anything was out of place, but it was pitch black. As my eyes slowly started adjusting to the deep darkness, though, I noticed something very strange. My closet door was wide open. I always keep that door closed. Always. It is one of those sliding doors that does not stay shut on its own very well, so I make a very strict point of sliding it completely closed every single night before I go to sleep. I know that might sound a bit weird or obsessive, but I have had a fear of open closet doors ever since I was a little kid. The point is, I did not leave it open. I knew for an absolute fact that I had closed it. I started to freak out a little bit. My brain was doing that typical thing, where it tries to desperately convince you that you are still dreaming. But I knew deep down that I was not. I was fully awake. I could feel my heart starting to pound heavily against my chest, and I could not shake this overwhelming feeling that something was really, really wrong. Without thinking it through, I reached over to my nightstand, grabbed my phone, and turned the flashlight on. I literally screamed out loud when I saw them. There were 2 distinct figures standing right at the edge of my bed. They were just standing there, completely still, looking down at me, before I could even make out any of their facial features or details. The 2 figures scattered in opposite directions, like they were trying to desperately avoid the beam of light. It was incredibly freaky how fast they moved. It was almost as if they had anticipated that I was about to turn a light on. I started flailing my phone around in a panic, trying to keep the flashlight beam on them, but they were simply too quick. In the chaos, I heard something heavy clatter loudly to the floor, but I did not have the time to process what it was. I just started screaming. I do not even know what I was screaming, to be honest. I think I was just making raw, terrified noise out of pure panic. The two figures bolted out of my room and headed straight for the bedroom door. I heard their footsteps pounding heavily down the hallway, and before I could even have a second thought, I jumped out of bed and started chasing after them. But by the time I made it out of my room and into the hallway, I heard the heavy front door slam shut. I ran into the living room, but they were already completely gone. I stood there in the middle of the living room, for I do not even know how long. My hands were shaking uncontrollably, and I was just trying to focus on catching my breath. The very moment I finally regained some of my composure, I ran back to my bedroom, locked the door, and called 911. While I was waiting for the police to arrive, sitting in the relative safety of my locked room, I finally turned the main overhead light on. That was when I looked down at the floor by the edge of my bed, right where the figures had been standing, and saw what had made that loud clattering noise during the commotion. It was one of my mom's largest kitchen knives. I almost threw up right then and there. I am not even kidding. Those people had been standing directly over me with a massive kitchen knife while I was fast asleep. If I had not woken up when I did, I do not even want to think about what would have happened. I probably would not have ever woken up again. The police showed up about 20 minutes later. They searched the entire house and the surrounding property, but there was absolutely no sign of anyone. Of course, they took my statement and asked me a whole bunch of questions. But then, one of the responding officers told me that I must have simply forgotten to lock the front door. I told him repeatedly that I distinctly remembered locking it before bed, but he just kind of shrugged his shoulders and said that was the only logical explanation. He explained that there were absolutely no signs of forced entry on any of the doors or windows, and every other entrance throughout the entire house was completely secure. The only thing that even could have been unlocked was the front door. I eventually accepted his explanation just to get them to leave, but in my heart, I knew I had locked that front door. Fast forward through the absolute nonsense of my parents getting home the next day, and immediately scolding me all over again for being irresponsible and forgetting to lock the door. There is really no need to get into all of that family drama. It has been 2 weeks now since that night, and I still do not have a single logical explanation for what happened. Forget the question of whether the front door had been locked or not. Why on earth were there two people standing in my bedroom with a kitchen knife? If they wanted to rob us, they could have easily just taken our electronics and left. It is not like I would have even noticed them coming and going if I had stayed asleep. At first, I thought that whoever broke into my house that night might have known that my parents were out of the country. But now I am starting to seriously doubt that theory. I have a very hard time believing that standard, everyday thieves would go out of their way to carry a knife into a sleeping person's bedroom just to kill them. It feels much more personal than that. I mean, think about it. If you are just a regular burglar looking to score some easy cash, your main goal is to avoid confrontation at all costs. You want to get in, grab whatever is valuable, and get out before anyone even knows you are there. You do not walk past a dark living room and a quiet kitchen, walk all the way down a long hallway, and stand directly over a sleeping person with a massive sharp kitchen knife in your hand. That is not a robbery, that is something far more sinister. And that is what keeps me up at night now. Every single time I close my eyes, I find myself wondering if those two people are still out there in the woods, waiting for my parents to leave again. Or if they are just waiting for me to fall back asleep so they can finish what they started. This kind of inexplicable terror, where you realize you are being watched and targeted without any logical explanation, is a feeling that Natasha knows all too well. Her ordeal began about 3 months ago, right after she broke up with her ex-boyfriend, Tibet. Natasha is 23 years old, and she had just moved into her very first solo apartment after living with roommates ever since she started college. The apartment itself was nothing special. It was just a simple one-bedroom unit in a mid-sized complex located in Columbus, Ohio. Since Natasha works completely remote, she is home a lot of the time. That was a big part of why she wanted her own place in the first place. She was incredibly tired of trying to take important work calls while her roommates were making noise in the kitchen or hanging out in the living room. Her new apartment was on the second floor, facing the back of the complex, which meant that her view was basically just the parking lot and a small line of trees. It was not exactly scenic, but she did not care about the view. She had her own space, her own schedule, and for the first time in her adult life, she had actual, complete privacy. For the first few weeks, everything was completely fine. Natasha did not really interact with anyone in the building, besides giving the occasional polite head nod when passing neighbors in the hallway. There was an older woman who lived on the first floor, who always seemed to be checking her mail whenever Natasha walked by. And there was a couple living directly across the hall, who she would occasionally hear arguing through the thin walls. That was pretty much the entire extent of her social landscape in the building. But then, she started noticing this guy. The very first time she saw him was about 3 weeks after she had moved in. She was coming back from her gym around 8 o'clock in the evening. As she was walking up the concrete stairs to her floor, she passed someone who was coming down. He was a very nondescript white guy, probably in his late 30s or early 40s. He had a very average build, and he was wearing a simple gray hoodie. There was really nothing remarkable about him at all. They did that classic awkward hallway dance, where you both try to move to the same side to let the other pass, and then he just kind of squeezed past her without saying a single word. Natasha did not think much of it at the time. The second time she saw him was just a few days later. She was out in the parking lot getting some groceries out of her car when she noticed him standing near the complex dumpsters. He was not really doing anything, just sort of standing there in the cold, looking around. When Natasha looked over at him, he immediately turned around and walked away, disappearing around the side of the building. Again, it was a bit odd, but not weird enough to worry about. She just shrugged it off and went about her day. The third time, however, is when things began to feel genuinely off. Natasha was working at her desk, which faces the window overlooking the parking lot. It was the middle of the afternoon, and she happened to glance outside while she was in the middle of a work call. She noticed a navy blue car parked in the lot that she did not recognize. Someone was sitting quietly in the driver's seat. She could not see their face clearly through the glass, but she could easily tell that they were looking directly up at the building. Specifically, they seemed to be staring right at her floor, and possibly even at her exact window, though she could not be absolutely sure. She watched the car for a few seconds, but since she was in the middle of a call, she eventually had to look back at her computer screen. When she checked again, maybe 10 minutes later, the blue car was completely gone. For whatever reason, that image stuck with her. She started paying a lot more attention to the parking lot after that day, and the more attention she paid, the more she started to notice him. The guy in the gray hoodie spent an unusual amount of time in that parking lot. It was not every single day, but it was often enough that it began to feel like a very deliberate pattern. Sometimes she would see him just walking slowly through the lot, and other times he would be sitting in that same navy blue car, which she realized belonged to him a few days later. Once she saw him standing right by the stairs of her building, just staring down at his phone. He never looked directly at her, or if he did, she never caught him in the act. But she began to get this lingering, deeply uncomfortable feeling that he was always positioning himself in a way where he could clearly see her apartment. She tried to tell herself that she was just being paranoid. The apartment complex was not that big after all. If someone lived there and kept similar hours to her, it made sense that she would see them around a lot. That was just simple math, and she had never actually caught him doing anything illegal or threatening. He was not following her, and he had never tried to approach her. He was just always around. But then, something happened that she could not explain away. Natasha has a very set, predictable daily routine. She goes to the exact same gym at the exact same time most days, and about twice a week, she usually stops at a specific Chipotle on her way back home. This Chipotle is about a 15-minute drive from her apartment, located in a completely different part of town. One night, she was sitting alone in the Chipotle, eating her dinner and scrolling through her phone. She happened to look up, and her heart nearly stopped. There he was, It was that exact same guy, wearing the exact same gray hoodie from the first day she had passed him on the stairs. He was sitting at a table directly across the restaurant, quietly eating a burrito bowl. Natasha started to feel physically sick to her stomach. She was not exaggerating when she said she felt a wave of nausea, because there was absolutely no logical reason for him to be there. The gym she goes to is in the complete opposite direction. This specific Chipotle is not even near any major shopping centers or attractions. It is not the kind of place where you just happen to end up by accident. You have to go there on purpose. She tried to rationalize it in her head. She told herself that Chipotle is a very popular restaurant, and he was just eating dinner, but he was also looking at her. It was not an obvious, aggressive stare. He would look down at his food, then glance up at her, and then look back down at his bowl. But she could feel his eyes on her. And when she finally got up to leave, she swore she saw him immediately start gathering his belongings too. Natasha walked to her car as fast as she could. She did not run, but she was moving with extreme urgency. She got inside, locked the doors immediately, and just sat there for a second, trying to breathe. When she looked back at the restaurant windows, she could not see him. She did not know if he had followed her outside, but she did not want to wait around to find out. On the drive home, she kept her eyes glued to her mirrors. She did not see anyone obviously following her, but she took a highly unusual, winding route back to her complex just to be safe. It was probably overkill, especially since the guy already knew exactly where her apartment was. But she was too panicked to think straight. When she finally got back to her apartment, she did not turn on any lights. She sat in the dark for nearly an hour, just watching the parking lot through her window. She never saw the man or his navy blue sedan return that night. So eventually, she convinced herself that she had simply overreacted, and she went to bed. But the next morning, she woke up and immediately looked outside, which had become a daily habit. The navy blue sedan was parked in the lot, and she could clearly see someone sitting inside it. This time, she did not hesitate. She called the police. She felt incredibly stupid while she was on the phone. What was she supposed to tell them? That there was a guy she kept seeing around, and it was making her feel uncomfortable. As silly as she felt, she called anyway and tried her best to explain the entire situation to the dispatcher. The responding officer she spoke with was polite, but it was very clear that he thought she was just being paranoid. He explained that they could send a patrol car to check the parking lot, but unless the man was actively doing something illegal, there was absolutely nothing they could do. He suggested that she start documenting everything, writing down dates, times, taking pictures of the car if she could, and to call them back if anything escalated. By the time a patrol car actually arrived, which was about 45 minutes later, the blue sedan was already gone. The officer walked around the complex, knocked on a few doors, and then told Natasha exactly what she had expected to hear. There was no sign of anyone suspicious, and none of the other residents had made any complaints. He handed her a business card and told her to call if anything else happened. Nothing happened for about a week after that. Natasha started to relax a little bit. She figured that maybe the sight of the police car had scared the creep away. Or perhaps she really had been imagining the whole thing, and her brain just needed a chance to reset. But then, she got the note. It had been slipped quietly under her apartment door sometime during the middle of the night. Natasha found it lying on the floor when she woke up in the morning. It was a handwritten note on a piece of lined paper. It read, "You should really close your blinds at night." And let us talk about that note for a second. The handwriting was neat, almost polite, which made the message feel even more disturbing. It was written in blue ink on a small, torn piece of lined paper. It did not have any name or signature, but the message was crystal clear. It was a warning, or maybe a threat. It proved that this man had not just been sitting in his car in the parking lot. He had actually walked up the concrete stairs to her second-floor landing, stood right outside her front door, and slid that piece of paper through the gap at the bottom. He had been close enough to touch her door. He had probably stood there in the quiet hallway, listening to whatever sounds were coming from inside her apartment, knowing that she was completely unaware of his presence. The thought of him standing just inches away from her, separated only by a thin piece of wood, made her skin crawl. Natasha was absolutely terrified. She remembers dropping the note onto the floor out of sheer fear before scrambling to pick it back up. Her hands were shaking uncontrollably, and she was hit with a horrible, heavy feeling of danger and absolute helplessness. She ended up moving out of that apartment just 2 weeks later. She did not even wait for her lease to end. She gladly paid the expensive financial penalty to break the contract and left immediately. She genuinely thought that would be the end of the nightmare. She moved back in with her parents, planning to stay there temporarily until she could find another apartment in a safer area. But if that was really the end of the story, she probably would not be sharing it today. About a month after she had moved back to her parents' house, she was driving back from the gym. This was a completely different gym, located close to her parents' neighborhood. And that was when she saw it. There was a navy blue sedan parked on a quiet side street, just 2 blocks away from her parents' home. She immediately recognized the car. She knew for an absolute fact that it was the exact same vehicle that had been sitting in her old apartment parking lot. Natasha sped the entire rest of the way home, trying her best not to completely lose her mind. She did not see anyone following behind her, but in a way that almost made the situation feel much worse, because if it was him, and she was almost positive it was, then he already knew exactly where she was living. She told her parents the moment she ran through the front door. Her dad promised to keep a close eye on the street, and her mom immediately went around, double-checking all the locks on the doors and windows. They have been watching the road very carefully ever since that day, and her dad even mentioned installing a security camera on the front porch. It has been about 2 weeks now, and she has not seen the blue sedan again. Part of her desperately wants to believe that it was all just a massive coincidence, that it was simply a similar-looking car, and she is losing her mind, but she knows what she saw. She has no idea how he could have possibly found her new address, and she really does not want to think about the terrifying possibility that she has a dedicated, obsessed stalker who is tracking her every move. She is honestly scared to do anything that involves leaving the house right now. She is debating whether to get the police involved again, but she knows there is very little she can actually tell them. These stories all share a very chilling, common thread. They show us how easily our sense of security can be shattered by people who operate in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to cross the line. Whether it is a trusted peer in a university classroom, an intruder hiding in a dark closet, or a silent figure watching from a parked car, the world can become a very small, terrifying place when you realize you are no longer safe. For the college student, the betrayal came from people she interacted with on a daily basis. Luke was someone she had allowed into her life, someone she trusted and cared for. And Roar was an educator, someone who was supposed to guide her academic journey. The fact that they were conspiring behind her back, turning her private life into a transaction, is a level of violation that is hard to fully comprehend. Even though they faced legal consequences, the lingering image of that silver sedan outside her sorority house is a haunting reminder that some nightmares never truly end. For Mikey, the terror was physical and immediate. The realization that two strangers had bypassed his security, entered his home, and stood over his sleeping body with a weapon is the ultimate violation of safety. The absolute lack of answers only makes the trauma worse. Were they looking to rob the house, or did they have a far more sinister motive? The fact that they left without taking anything, leaving only a kitchen knife behind, suggests a level of intent that is deeply disturbing. Mikey is left with the haunting knowledge that he only survived because he happened to wake up at the exact right moment. And for Natasha, the horror came in the form of a slow, calculating obsession. A stranger who slowly inserted himself into her daily routine, tracking her movements from her apartment to her gym, and even to a restaurant miles away. The handwritten note under her door was a clear message that she was never truly alone, even behind closed doors. And the sudden appearance of his car near her parents' house suggests that a change of address is not enough to escape a dedicated predator. Natasha is left living in a state of constant vigilance, wondering if the next time she looks out her window, that navy blue sedan will be waiting for his chance. We often like to believe that our homes are impenetrable fortresses, and that the people we interact with are harmless. But these cases serve as a sobering reminder that danger can take many forms, and it often arrives when we least expect it. The survivors of these events are left to pick up the pieces of their lives, trying to rebuild a sense of safety that was stolen from them in an instant. They are left with unanswered questions, heightened anxiety, and the constant, nagging fear that the past might someday catch up to them. As we look at these stories, we have to wonder about the gaps in our security systems, both physical and societal. How do we protect ourselves from the people who are determined to do us harm? How do we regain our peace of mind once it has been shattered? There are no easy answers to these questions, and perhaps that is the most terrifying part of all. We can lock our doors, close our blinds, and try to stay vigilant, but ultimately, we are all vulnerable to the unexpected dark corners of the human experience. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. This happened last fall, when I was staying in a small town in northern Pennsylvania for work. I do commercial refrigeration repair, and at the time, I was driving to different grocery stores and restaurants in smaller towns because our company was short on people. The town I was sent to was the kind of place where everything shut down early, and there were more empty buildings than open ones. I was supposed to be there for 3 nights, while I worked on the walk-in freezers at an older family-owned supermarket. My company booked me a motel on the edge of town, because it was the only place nearby with any vacancy. I got there a little after 7 on a Thursday. The motel was one of those single-floor places where all the room doors faced the parking lot. It had 12 rooms total and only 4 or 5 cars in the lot. The office smelled like old coffee and bleach. The woman at the desk was in her 60s. She was friendly, but there was something distracted about her. She kept glancing past me toward the parking lot while I was checking in. When she handed me the key, she told me if anyone knocked on my door at night not to answer it unless it was her or the owner, and she said if I heard anything weird outside to call the office and not get involved. She said it in a casual voice like it was normal advice, but it caught me off guard. I asked if that was because the area was bad, and she just said there were some drifters around sometimes, and they liked to ask guests for money. I remember thinking it was a strange thing to say to someone who had just arrived, but I was tired and did not really care. My room was near the far end, second to last. Inside, it was clean enough, but it was kind of old. I noticed cigarette burns in the dresser, and the carpet had dark spots. I brought my bag in, grabbed food at the gas station down the road, and came back around 8. While I was walking to my room, I noticed a man sitting in an older dark green pickup truck 2 spaces away from mine. The truck was running, but the headlights were off. I could not see his face clearly because of how dark it was, but I remember he did not look at me like a normal person would when someone walks by. He just sat perfectly still with both hands on the wheel. I assumed he was waiting for someone. I went inside and spent the next hour eating and watching random stuff on my phone. Around 10:30, I took a shower and got into bed. Maybe 20 minutes later, I heard footsteps outside my room. That did not bother me at first because other people were staying there. Then the footsteps stopped right outside my door. I waited for someone to unlock it or knock on the room next to mine, but nothing happened. After maybe 15 seconds, the steps moved on. A minute later, I heard them again, slowly coming back the other direction and stopping outside my door a second time. Still no knock, just silence. And then the footsteps walked away again. I got up and looked through the peephole, but I could not see anyone. It was probably just someone drunk or confused about which room was theirs. A little after 11, I was half asleep when someone knocked on the door. I stayed still and waited. Then the person knocked again, the same exact way. I got up quietly and looked through the peephole again. There was nobody there. That made my stomach drop a little. The parking lot lights were dim, but the walkway in front of the rooms was empty. I stood there for a while, then locked the deadbolt again, even though it was already locked. I was about to get back into bed when I noticed the curtain near the window had shifted slightly. It was not open enough to see out, just enough to make me realize someone might be able to see in from outside, depending on where they stood. I moved it shut and turned off the lamp. I stayed awake another half hour listening. Right around midnight, I heard something that sounded like metal, lightly scraping against metal near the door. I got up and stepped as quietly as I could to the door. For the 3rd time, I looked through the peephole. This time I saw movement. Somebody was crouched low, almost underneath the peephole view. I could only see the top of a dark baseball cap and one shoulder. I do not know how long I stood there, but it could not have been more than 5 seconds before the person stood up and moved away. I heard footsteps going fast toward the end of the building. I called the office right away. The woman who answered sounded annoyed at first, until I told her someone had been right outside my door. Then she got quiet and asked if I had opened it, to which I said no. She told me to stay inside and said the owner was going to check outside. About 2 minutes later, I saw headlights sweep across the curtain. Someone drove slowly through the lot and then left. The office called back and said nobody was there now, and it was probably just someone messing around. I asked if I should call the police, and she said it would not do any good unless the person came back. I barely slept after that. Every little sound woke me up. At some point around 3 in the morning I did pass out, but I woke up around 5:15 to the sound of my truck door opening alarm. I jumped out of bed and looked through the window without moving the curtain much. There was a man standing at the driver's side of my truck with the door half open. He was tall and wearing a dark jacket and hat. I could not see his face because he was turned away from me. Then he looked straight toward my room like he knew I was watching. He shut the truck door and walked off fast toward the road behind the motel. I called 911 this time. The police came about 15 minutes later. They took a report and checked my truck, but they found nothing missing because I never leave anything in it. One officer asked if I was sure I locked it, which made me feel like they already did not believe me. I knew I locked it. The older officer did seem more interested when I told him about the knocking and the crouching outside my door. He asked the motel owner if they had cameras. They did, but only one in the office and one pointing at the front entrance. Nothing covering my side of the lot. Before the cops left, the older one told me, if it happened again, not to open my door for any reason and to leave as soon as I could in the morning. I asked if they thought it was random, and he just said probably, but his face did not really match that answer. I had to work that day, and I was already there, so I stayed. I figured I was overreacting anyway. During the day, everything felt normal. I was at the supermarket from 7 in the morning to almost 6 in the evening, and by the time I got back to the motel, it was dark again. I parked directly under the brightest light and carried all my tools inside at once, so I would not have to go back out. The woman at the desk saw me and asked if I was okay. I told her I had not slept. She hesitated for a second, and then said if I wanted she could move me to room 2 near the office. I asked why she had not offered that the night before. She said she did not think it was necessary. Then she added something I have thought about a couple times since. She said it usually does not happen 2 nights in a row. I asked what that meant, and she immediately acted like she had misspoken. She just said the drifters normally move on. That made me more uneasy than I already was. I seriously thought about packing up and driving an hour to another hotel, but I was exhausted, filthy from work, and told myself I could just stay one more night and leave in the morning. Around 8, I got food and brought it back to my room. While I was eating, I heard a truck drive slowly through the lot. I looked through the curtain and saw the same dark green pickup from the night before. It drove past my room, turned around near the road, and parked at the very end of the lot with the lights off. I could not see who was inside. I called the office and told them. The owner answered this time, not the woman. He sounded irritated and told me if the truck was not blocking me in or damaging anything, there was not much he could do. I asked if he knew who it was, and he just said people come and go. I sat there for maybe an hour checking the window every few minutes. The truck never moved. Eventually I turned off the television and lights and tried to sleep with my clothes still on. Sometime after 11 I heard someone walking outside again. Slow, super slow steps. Then a soft tap at the window, not the door. I stayed in the bed. Then another tap came, this time closer to the center of the glass. Then a fingernail or something dragged slowly down the window. I could hear it clearly. I had never felt fear like that, because I knew the person was standing inches away from where I was lying, and they knew I was in there pretending to be asleep. I grabbed my phone and started dialing 911, but before I hit call, I heard the bathroom window rattle. It was a tiny frosted window above the toilet. Then I heard something even worse. The sound of the room next to mine opening, like an actual key or tool working the lock, and then the door opening. The room next to me had been empty when I checked in. I knew that because I had looked through the crack in the curtains the night before and never saw a car or lights there. I got out of bed and crouched near the wall that connected our rooms. I heard movement next door. Not the heavy footsteps of somebody checking into a room, more like somebody trying not to make a sound. I called 911 and whispered everything as quietly as I could. The dispatcher kept telling me to stay on the line. While I was talking, I heard one hard hit on the shared wall behind the headboard, like someone testing how solid it was. Then another lower down, and then just nothing. I was trying so hard to listen that I could hear my own breathing and heartbeat. Then I heard the bathroom window in my room start to move. It was not rattling this time. It was opening, but just a little. I ran to the bathroom and shoved it closed with both hands. Something on the other side pushed back once. Not that hard, but enough for me to feel it. I locked it even though the latch looked flimsy as hell, and then I backed away. The dispatcher told me officers were 2 minutes out. I could hear movement outside my front door now too, like there was more than one person. Then came the soft knocks on the door like the night before. I did not answer. At that point, I grabbed the motel chair and jammed it under the doorknob, even though I knew that probably would not do much. The police arrived maybe a minute later, but it felt like 10. As soon as headlights hit the curtains, I heard running. It was at least 2 sets of footsteps. The officers found that the screen on my bedroom window had been removed and was lying in the bushes. They also found fresh pry marks on my truck door and on the door of the empty room next to mine. What I did not find out until later was the worst part. The older officer from that morning came back and asked me privately if I had anyone angry at me or if I had posted online that I was staying there. I said no. Then he told me they had seen the green pickup before. According to him, there had been 2 other incidents in the previous 6 months, involving men staying alone at that same motel for work. In both cases, someone had tried getting into their vehicles during the night. One guy said he heard people outside his room, but left before reporting anything else. The other one woke up to his motel door cracked open, even though he swore he had locked it. Nothing had been taken in either case. The officers said they believed the group was following out-of-town men from bars or work sites, then waiting until they were isolated and trying to get inside their rooms. He never said exactly what he thought the end goal was, but he did not need to. I packed my stuff while 2 officers stood outside. When I checked under the bed before leaving, which I normally never do anywhere, there was a folded piece of paper shoved almost against the wall. I only noticed it because I dropped my phone charger. It was part of a local newspaper torn into a square, and on the back somebody had written my room number and my truck plate in pen. That meant whoever it was had not just picked me at random that night. They had been watching long enough to write things down. I left the motel before 1 in the morning and drove almost 2 hours home. Even though I had 1 more day of work scheduled, my company sent someone else the next week, and I found out later he stayed in a different town. Besides my recounting of this story just now, I really tried to just put this experience behind me. This next story started in October of 2025. I was single and decided to download Tinder to see if I could find a potential partner. After a few swipes, I got a match. "Killian liked you back," the screen said. I started smiling and opened with a message saying, "Hey, what is up?" He responded quickly and we started talking all day, every day. He was in the military at a base not too far away from where I lived. Eventually, after a few weeks of talking, he became extremely possessive over me. He would say things like, "You are mine, and if I cannot have you, no one can." He also said that if I blocked or unfriended him, he would kill me, along with other scary threats. Keep in mind, we never even started dating. One day in December, he just unfriended me on Snapchat, and I did not think too much of it. I moved on and kept living my life until a few days ago when he suddenly added me again. Remembering the threats, I decided to add him back so he would not do anything crazy. He sent a snap that said he had been thinking about my beautiful smile for 8 weeks now. He said he kept thinking about what we could be if he did not let his dark thoughts win. I responded saying that is cute, simply because I did not want to piss him off. We started talking again, and I responded mostly out of fear over what he might do if I did not. He was acting like a possessive boyfriend, always asking where I was and who I was with. He kept asking me to turn on my Snapchat map, so he could make sure I was safe. I did not want to do that because he seriously freaked me out. Thursday last week, I was driving around with my friend until about 1 in the morning. I asked if he could drop me off at home, which he did. We said our goodbyes, and I walked up the alleyway to my house. Keep in mind, I never gave Killian my address. I saw a man standing there in the dark, and did not think much of it until he called my name. I did not know who he was, so I responded asking yes, who is asking. Then I saw his face. I felt my heart skip a beat. I started cold sweating. I felt panic in my body and started shaking. He then grabbed my neck with his hand and slammed my head hard into the wall and started studying my face. He kept saying things like, "Who were you with?" and "Why are you out this late? And was it a man?" I just stood there completely terrified. This entire time he was choking me so hard I had literal tears in my eyes and was gasping for air. I genuinely thought he was going to kill me. He kept choking harder until he eventually threw me to the ground head first. I whimpered from the pain and gasped for air as he let go of my throat. I looked him in the eyes and saw nothing. There were no emotions there. He did not feel bad at all. All of a sudden, he sat on top of me and slapped me hard across the face. I put my hand where he hit me as tears filled my eyes again. Then he started choking me again. This time I was more sure that he was going to kill me. I looked up at the black sky and started thinking about my deceased dog. I even started smiling as I felt myself about to pass out. Then he suddenly let go of my throat. He said he had to go because the last bus was leaving in 3 minutes. Then he ran away while I lay on the cold, wet ground trying to catch my breath. I was in shock and did not know what to do. I decided to call my best friend and try to tell him what happened, but I could not talk. My vocal cords had been choked so badly I could not make a sound. My best friend only heard strange noises and said he was on his way. When I got to my friend's house, I fell asleep on the couch within 3 minutes because I was completely exhausted. While I was sleeping, my friend called the police and told them the situation. The next day, my friend drove me to the police station to give my statement, and I did. After I had been questioned, the police decided my life was in too much danger to just let me go without protection. I was given an alarm device, a tracking device with multiple buttons that would immediately alert the police of my location, so they could save me because we all knew he would come back. 3 days ago, I was followed by a friend of Killian. If the plan had not been for me to be picked up by a friend nearby, I do not think I would be here to tell this story. The police told me Killian's intention was to kill me. So, if he had his own car or if there had been a later bus, I would probably be dead. Every time I leave the house or go outside, I fear he is watching, which he told me he always will be. One day, I might not see him coming, and he might be waiting in that dark alleyway again, and I might not trigger the alarm fast enough. I am not safe, and I just wanted to share the story in case I do end up getting killed. Be careful, everyone. I never even gave him my info to find me. My name is Mike, and this happened last October when I decided to take a solo camping trip in the Smoky Mountains. I had been feeling burnt out from my high-stress job, and just wanted a couple of quiet days away from everything. I had done solo trips before and never had any issues, so this did not feel like a big deal at the time. I left early in the morning and the drive took most of the day. A couple of hours before reaching the park, I stopped at a small roadside diner because I was getting hungry, and I knew food options would be limited once I got deeper into the mountains. The place was pretty empty. Just a few older people drinking coffee, and a waitress who looked like she had been working there forever. I sat at the counter and ordered a burger and fries. While I was eating, I noticed a man sitting a few stools down from me. He was not doing anything strange exactly, but he kept glancing in my direction without really turning his head. I remember thinking he probably just noticed I was not local. The trail was not hard, but it took longer than I expected, and I started realizing I was going to be setting up camp close to dark. I eventually found a small clearing that looked good enough. It was flat and had enough space for my tent and a small fire. I rushed to get everything set up before it got too dark. By the time I finished setting up the tent, the light was already fading and the woods were getting that gray color they get right before night. I gathered some sticks and got a small fire going. Sitting by that fire actually felt nice at first. I just listened to the normal sounds you would expect in the woods, like bugs and wind through the trees. After maybe half an hour, I heard something that did not match the other sounds. It was the sound of footsteps on leaves. Surely human footsteps. I looked up and saw a man standing maybe 30 or 40 feet away between the trees. He was standing there, just facing me. I could tell he was watching me. I called out asking if he was all right. He stepped closer into the firelight and said hello, just that single word. I asked if he was camping nearby and deflected my question with another question, asking if I was out there alone. That question made my stomach drop. I hesitated and told him no, that my friends were meeting me soon. That was a complete and total lie. He just nodded slowly like he accepted that answer. Then he turned around and started walking back into the woods without another word. I watched him the whole time. As he got farther away, he started blending into the darkness between the trees. Right before he disappeared completely, he stopped and turned back toward my fire. He just stood there again, facing me. I got the feeling he did not think I could still see him, but I could barely make out his outline. He stood there for what felt like several minutes. I did not want him to know I was watching, so I pretended to look down at his phone. My whole body felt tense, and I did not feel safe going into my tent while he was still out there. Eventually, I looked back up, and he was gone. I stayed sitting by the fire another 20 to 30 minutes, trying to listen for any more movement. I did not hear anything else, but I did not feel relaxed anymore. I finally put the fire out and got into my tent. I tried to tell myself I was overreacting, and that he was probably just another camper who was curious. I laid there trying to fall asleep, but I do not think I ever fully relaxed. About an hour later, I heard footsteps again. This time they were much closer. I could hear them slowly moving around my campsite, leaves crunching in a circle around my tent. Then they stopped right outside. Everything went completely silent. I held my breath without even realizing I was doing it. I did not know if someone was standing right outside the thin fabric of my tent, or if I was just imagining it. But then I heard the sound of a man exhaling right outside. It was not loud, just a slow breath like someone standing still. And I do not mean that he was trying to make me hear it. I think I was just so hyper-focused that I heard something I usually would not hear. Every instinct I had told me not to move or make a sound. I was afraid that if he knew I was awake, he might do something. So I just stayed completely still, pretending to be asleep. After God knows how long, I heard the footsteps slowly move away again. I waited a long time before even letting myself breathe normally. About 10 minutes later, the footsteps came back. It was the same circling around the tent. Then he stopped again, and then the same silence. This went on for hours. Sometimes the steps would fade off into the distance, and I would think he finally left. Then they would come back again. Either he was walking away and returning, or he was standing somewhere in the trees just watching and coming closer whenever he felt like it. I never heard any talking, but something about the way the steps sounded made me feel like it was not just one person anymore. I cannot explain why. Maybe it was just fear messing with my head. At one point, I noticed the inside of my tent starting to get lighter. I realized the sun was starting to come up and that I had been awake the entire night. As soon as there was enough light, I decided I was leaving. I did not even bother eating. I just started stuffing things into my bag as fast as I could. My hands were shaking the whole time. When I finally unzipped my tent and stepped out, I immediately heard multiple sets of footsteps running off into the woods. Not just one, several. I could not see anyone, but I could clearly hear the sound of more than one person moving away through the leaves fast. That was the moment I knew I had not imagined anything. I did not even finish packing properly. I just grabbed what I could carry and started jogging back toward the trail. I kept expecting to hear someone following me, but I did not. I reached my car. I locked the doors and I just sat there trying to calm down. At some point, I must have fallen asleep because I woke up hours later with the sun high in the sky. Part of me tried to rationalize everything, like maybe it was just a couple other campers messing with me. I even considered going back to get the rest of my stuff since I had left some gear behind in my rush. It was full daylight now, and I figured whatever happened at night would not happen during the day. So I walked back down the trail. When I got to where I was certain my campsite had been, I stopped completely. My tent was gone, my sleeping bag was gone, the small cooking supplies I left were gone, every last thing was gone. The only thing left was the black circle of ashes from my fire. I walked around the area thinking maybe I had the wrong spot, but I knew I did not. The trees and rocks were exactly how I remembered. Someone had taken everything. I did not see any trash or damage, just empty ground like I had never been there. I did not look around any longer. I just turned around and walked straight back to my car. I did not report it or try to find my stuff. I just wanted to get out of there. Losing the gear did not matter to me anymore. The only thing that mattered was leaving without getting hurt. I drove straight home that day, and I have not gone camping alone since. Sometimes I still think about how many people were actually out there that night, and how close they were standing to me while I pretended to sleep. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. There is a unique kind of quiet that comes with a heavy snowfall. In my small suburban neighborhood in southern Quebec, that quiet usually feels very peaceful. But for me, that silence is always there. I have a hearing disability that has made me hard of hearing for most of my life. I have learned to navigate the world a little differently because of it, relying heavily on my other senses. Still, I look back on what happened to me about a year ago, and I constantly wonder what could have happened, and what I should have done differently. It was right after the holiday season, and I was finally settling back down from traveling and all the get-togethers with family and friends. My quiet neighborhood borders a thick forest, and since most of the residents know each other, it has a warm, safe atmosphere. During the winter, I love to take my dog Monty for walks in those local woods. He is a Rottweiler Husky mix, which is perfect for me since I enjoy going for runs from time to time. The forest has several trails, none of which are challenging. On this specific afternoon in February, I had just finished having a late lunch and decided to take Monty out. As usual, Monty went absolutely ballistic when we turned the corner of my street towards the forest entrance. It was relatively cold, and a fresh blanket of snow had fallen overnight, creating a blank canvas. There were already a few yellow patches and boot prints near the entrance, signaling that some neighbors had taken their dogs out earlier. Most people like to walk before noon because the winter sun sets around 4 in the afternoon, so I did not expect to see anyone else out at that time. After walking for around 30 minutes, we came to a fork in the path. I noticed that one of the paths had not been walked yet, so feeling adventurous I decided to take it. I had a solid memory of the trails, so I knew exactly where I was going. The trail led to a clearing, which was great since I wanted to check out the native birds with the binoculars I had gotten for Christmas. I remember scanning the tree line in the distance until I saw a strange shape. When I focused my binoculars, I saw a blue tarp and what looked to be a makeshift shelter. As curious as I was, it was getting dark, so I turned around and started walking back. Monty ran up ahead, but something seemed off in his behavior. He was much more alert and was sniffing the trail more than he normally would. When I looked down, my eyes widened. There was a set of footprints in the snow, much larger than my own. I turned my boots over out of sheer confusion to compare them. The prints were different, which left me with even more questions. There were no other forks in the trail, so whoever took it had to have passed me at some point. I figured they must have passed me while I was using my binoculars. At the time, it seemed like the most logical explanation, so I tried not to overthink it. At this point, it was significantly darker outside, but I could still make out my surroundings. As we were walking back, Monty stopped abruptly and started barking relentlessly in my direction. As I turned around, that is when I saw him. There was a man probably around 6 feet 4 inches tall, wearing charcoal-colored snow pants and a white camo jacket, standing only about a meter away from me. He did not make any movements towards me. He just stood there with his hands in his coat pockets. I did not recognize him, so I assumed he must have been a hiker from out of town. He looked like he was muttering something to me, but I could not read his lips due to the lack of lighting and my hearing disability. I also did not know if he was speaking English or French, which are both common in Quebec. I felt like an idiot for not bringing my phone with me, so I ended up trying to gesture to him that I was hard of hearing and that it was getting late. I got back home around 4:30, and by then, it was completely dark out. I followed my standard night routine, not really thinking much about the encounter, but in the middle of the night, something happened that still shakes me to this day. I woke up suddenly to Monty licking my hand. I checked my phone, and to my surprise, it was 3 in the morning. I noticed a text message from my neighbor asking if everything was all right. The message was a few minutes old and said Monty had been barking like he was possessed. I looked up to find that Monty was no longer in my room. I walked downstairs to find him barking hysterically at the glass patio door. As I approached, my vision was still blurry. I tried to focus my eyes when the backyard motion sensor light suddenly turned on. At that moment, my heart sank. The man from the forest was standing right there in my backyard. I stepped away from the door and texted 911 as fast as I could. I ran up to my room with Monty and grabbed the machete from under my bed. I am a shorter woman, and although I have a background in martial arts, I know very well that the best move in a fight is to not fight at all. I sat there in my room guarding Monty and myself, waiting for the police. With my heart beating out of my chest, I sat opposite the door with Monty by my side. It did not last long before Monty sprang up and began barking violently at the bedroom door. My hands were sweating profusely as I watched a shadow cast from underneath the door. The movement suggested the man was seconds from breaking in. Those had to be the longest minutes of my life. Luckily for me, the door never opened. When the police arrived, they searched the property and found the glass on the patio door had been completely smashed. The gate in my backyard was open, leading to the forest, which is where they believe the man disappeared to. I let them know about the shelter, and then stayed with a family friend for a few days. Ever since that day, I decided to stick to the main roads when walking Monty, trying not to think about what might have happened. If you think that forest encounter was terrifying, what happened to two young sisters in Illinois will make you lock your doors twice tonight. My name is Ember, and I am 16 years old. I live with my younger sister Kate, who is 15, and our parents. Our dad works for a deforestation group about 30 minutes from our house. It was a completely normal morning on December 5th, as my sister and I were getting ready to go out to the movies. We decided to go watch a somewhat new horror movie, Terrifier 3, which had some Christmas elements included in it. We knew the movie was rated 18+, but nobody paid much attention to our age, since we both looked older than we actually were anyway. We made our way to the theater and easily got in thanks to our appearance. However, halfway through the film, as everyone was eagerly anticipating the next scene, my phone suddenly buzzed loudly enough for the whole theater to hear. It completely ruined the vibe of the movie, and I could feel everyone turning toward me with highly annoyed looks on their faces. Embarrassed, my sister and I quickly scurried out of the row, and in my rush, I actually ended up tripping, which was incredibly embarrassing. Once we made it out of the theater lobby, I checked my phone to see who had been calling me. It was my dad. Instead of calling him back, I immediately received a text message from his number. The message said something like, "Hey, would you mind bringing me some lunch since the small cafe in the woods is shut today?" I looked over at Kate, and she looked back at me, a little confused, but neither of us second-guessed the message, since it seemed like a perfectly normal request. We arrived back home, packed up some food for him, and took my car down to the woods where he was working. I had always loved those woods and never felt uneasy there because the area was large, peaceful, and beautifully secluded. The scenery was amazing, featuring a steep hill that led down to a quiet lake that was perfect for fishing and photos. After a while, Kate and I got out of the car and began walking down the snowy path through the woods. I took out my phone to call my dad to let him know we were there, but he did not pick up. Confused, I looked over at Kate, who was just as puzzled as I was. Why would he not respond to our call when he had just texted us while we were at the movies? I decided to text him instead, reminding him that we were currently in the woods to deliver his lunch. After a few moments, I saw the 3 little dots appear on my screen, showing that he was typing. He responded by telling us to walk down the small hill and wait for him at the lake, which we immediately did. The sun was slowly setting since it was winter, meaning the sunset came much earlier than usual. The sky had a beautiful radiant orange glow over the hills. Snapping out of my thoughts, Kate suddenly pointed down to the lake where a man dressed in black was sitting on the wooden deck by the water, with his back turned to us. We both assumed it was our dad. We walked down a bit more and stopped a little behind him. I called out his name, but he did not move or react. Kate suddenly grew very uneasy, and her anxious attitude made the entire scene feel extremely eerie. Slowly, I reached out and pulled off the hood he was wearing, which revealed a man who was definitely not our dad. Kate and I shrieked in terror as he turned around and began waving my dad's phone around like a maniac, smiling wildly as if he was happy to see us so scared. I blurted out, asking him why he was using our dad's phone, but he did not respond at all. Instead, he suddenly lunged forward and grabbed Kate's arm as she screamed in terror. Luckily, I was strong enough to pull her away from his grip, and we both started running back up the hill as fast as we possibly could. The adrenaline pushed through us so much that I had never seen either of us run that fast before. Behind me, I could hear heavy stomping footsteps getting closer, so I knew we were actively being chased. I did not dare to turn around. Finally, we reached the safety of my car. I slammed the door shut and locked it just as the man came up to my window, and then he suddenly crouched down out of sight. Terrified, I put the car in reverse and sped away back home. When we arrived home, my dad and mom were both sitting there in the living room. We arrived panting, completely out of breath, and frantically explained the whole situation to them. My dad was absolutely furious, and explained that his phone had been stolen out of his truck while he was working, which was why he had decided to come back home early. He realized the man must have taken his phone and messaged us. My dad immediately called the police and filed a report. They used the tracking number to locate the device, which was still sitting on the wooden deck by the lake, and they eventually returned the phone to my dad. They told us there was not much else they could do since the phone had already been found, and the suspect was gone. I honestly thought this was the absolute end of it, but I would not be telling this story if it was. 6 hours later, around 1 in the morning, I got a text from an unknown number. The message said, "I like that your house is lit only by your bedroom television." I immediately went completely cold and pale. I paused the television and heard a distinct rustling sound directly outside my window. My room was on the second floor. I shut my phone and listened closely. Slowly, I peeked through the blinds and saw the man standing there, smiling, with a gun pointed directly at my window. I screamed and pulled away, just as the glass shattered everywhere across my room. My parents ran in, followed closely by Kate. I screamed for them to crouch down and told them the man was outside with a gun. When my dad went to check, the man was already gone. Then we suddenly heard another loud bang and more glass breaking downstairs in the kitchen. We ran and locked ourselves in my parents' bedroom as Kate called 911. My mom hugged us as we cried in absolute fear. Throughout the whole situation, I kept wondering how he had managed to find out exactly where we lived. A few moments later, the police arrived and searched the entire house, but nobody was there. Kate and I explained the situation again, and one of the officers suggested they check my car. Surprisingly, a small electronic tracking tag was found placed deep inside my tire well, which perfectly explained how the man knew where we lived, and why he had crouched down before I sped out of the woods. The police told us they would patrol the streets and do everything they could to find him. A few months later, he still had not been found, but he never returned. My family is still traumatized, and I feel stupid for not being alarmed when he only responded through texts, but I will definitely be more careful from now on. Our final story takes us back to the freezing winter of 2021, during the height of the pandemic. One word to describe my day back then was hectic. Work was a complete disaster. Since it was prime pandemic times, I was working entirely from home, which meant my schedule was always all over the place. I was supposed to be meeting with my extended family upstate for the holidays, but I ended up getting stuck on a nearly 3-hour Zoom meeting for work. By the time I finally managed to log off, it was a whole hour and a half after everyone else had already arrived at my parents' house. And that did not even include the next 2 hours or so that the long trek up to their place would take me in my car. Before leaving, I filled up 2 large cups of coffee in my kitchen to take with me. I knew I would need every single drop of caffeine to make it through the drive. The second I opened my front door, however, I realized this drive was going to be much more of a disaster than I had originally anticipated. The snow and wind had already picked up significantly since earlier that evening, and the streets were barely even plowed. The ground had at least 2 feet of snow already, and the weather forecast said it was supposed to keep snowing like this for a majority of the night. Because of the terrible conditions, I was forced to drive under 25 miles per hour on most of the residential roads. My car at the time was a really old, crappy Hyundai, which was not ideal for extreme weather conditions at all. It did not have anti-lock brakes either, making every stop a guessing game. I am usually a pretty fast driver though, so when I finally managed to get on the highway, I raised my speed to 70 miles per hour. It was probably a lot faster than was safe for the current road conditions, but I was desperate to get to my destination. I finally arrived at my parents' house around 9 o'clock. They had already begun dinner without me, but thankfully they were not too far along, so I was able to join in. After a few drinks and sharing some holiday gifts, I started to completely lose track of time. I got so caught up in seeing all of my relatives, whom I had not spoken to in a while, that I ended up basically forgetting that I still had a long drive home ahead of me, even as most of my family members had started to say their goodbyes and leave. Once I finally got back into my car to head home, it was past midnight, and at least another foot of fresh snow had accumulated on the ground. I was a bit buzzed from the drinks, but I figured I was sober enough to drive home. I do not condone drinking and driving at all, but I was tired and simply wanted to get back to my own bed. As I was heading back towards the highway, I realized the local roads were completely dead. Not a single other vehicle was in sight. I made the grave mistake of raising my speed to 40 miles per hour down one particular stretch of road. As I began to approach a sharp bend, I suddenly realized my car had gone into a dangerous skid. I tried not to panic, as this was not the first time I had skidded on ice. I started to steer into the direction of the skid and downshifted the gears to slow down. But as I got even closer to the curve and my car still was not slowing down, absolute panic set in. My car went straight off the side of the road, crashed into a large tree, and the airbag deployed. I was momentarily in total shock from the force of the impact. But thankfully, I was relatively unscathed other than a few minor bumps. My car, on the other hand, was completely ruined. The entire front hood was buried deep in a massive bank of snow surrounding the tree I had hit. There was absolutely no chance of me pushing it back onto the road by myself. The very first thing I did was call my roadside assistance company, and they told me they would send a tow truck to my location. But because of the horrible weather conditions, they warned me it could take up to 40 minutes for the truck to reach me. I was stranded on a completely deserted road, surrounded by thick forest with no houses for miles in either direction. I decided to call my parents and ask one of them to drive over and wait with me in the cold. My dad said he would get in his car and drive over right away. I hung up the phone and waited in the quiet car. As I was sitting there, I began to hear something over the sound of the wind howling outside. There were undeniably footsteps crunching in the deep snow. I could not tell exactly from where they were coming, but they sounded somewhat distant. I opened the driver's side door and stepped out, looking over the roof of my car into the dark. I was not hearing the footsteps anymore. Instead, I was hearing some new strange sounds. It was hard to describe, but it sounded like a wet, heavy slurping. I looked over to where I thought the sound was coming from, and I could see some slight movement by the tree line. It was dark as hell, but I was pretty certain I was looking at the silhouette of a person standing there. I called out a loud hello, but the slurping sound stopped immediately and no one answered. I sat there for a few more seconds awkwardly, but no one ever responded or appeared. I was officially freaked out, so I got back inside my car and locked the doors. Less than a minute later, I heard footsteps in the snow again. Then I suddenly heard a loud thud hit the passenger side window. I could not see out of it because it was covered in snow. Once again, I opened the driver's side door and stepped out. Checking my surroundings, I made a disturbing discovery. There were fresh boot prints circling all around my car, leading into the dark woods. I also noticed there were dark drops of fresh blood in the snow. I grabbed my 9mm handgun from the glove compartment and began to follow the footprints into the woods. A few yards in, my flashlight revealed a dead, decapitated deer, with its stomach ripped completely open. This was getting too weird, so I quickly headed back to my car. I opened the driver's side door, and I had to keep myself from vomiting. Lying directly in my driver's seat was the severed head of the deer, staring right at me. I booked it out of there, running down the dark road until headlights appeared. It was my dad. I got in and explained everything, but he did not believe me. We drove back together to inspect the scene. The footprints were still there, but the deer head was completely gone. All that remained was a large dark pool of blood on my seat, and drag marks in the snow. I chose not to call the police. I have no idea who was in the woods that night. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. This happened just a few months ago. I have been driving for Lyft for a few years now, and I usually stick to the late night shifts. The roads are much quieter during those hours, and the tips are usually a lot better. But there is a major trade-off when you work the graveyard shift. Every once in a while you get a passenger or a story that completely sticks with you, and not in a good way. Before this night, I had always thought of myself as a pretty careful person. I had dealt with my fair share of odd passengers, but nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing, even came close to being as strange as what I am about to tell you. I did not have a dashcam at the time, which was a huge mistake. In fact, that night was the exact reason I finally went out and installed one. It started off like any other shift. It was just me and the occasional odd rattle my car would make. I drive this beat-up, gold 2005 Volvo. It is definitely not the prettiest vehicle, but it is reliable as hell. The streets were quite literally deserted, which I prefer because it makes the job so much more peaceful. But sometime after 2 in the morning, I got a request from a convenience store nearby. At first, it seemed harmless, but for some reason, the moment I accepted, I got this really weird feeling in my gut. Have you ever gotten that sudden feeling that something is just completely off? You cannot explain why, but your body is telling you to stay away. That is exactly what hit me as I turned the corner and drove toward the pickup spot. Before I even saw the guy, I figured out why my gut was warning me. The convenience store I was pulling up to was completely closed. All the lights were shut off, and there was not a single car in the entire lot. As I pulled closer to the curb, that was when I saw him. I made sure to drive very slowly so I could get a good look at him. He was pacing outside the entrance, wearing this incredibly ratty hoodie. It looked like it had not been washed in years. I am not even kidding, because there was literally a giant hole torn open in the sleeve. His movements were incredibly jerky and unpredictable. He could not stand still for even a second. He kept glancing over his shoulder like he thought someone was actively chasing him. If I had to guess, I would have bet he was on some kind of heavy drug. I probably should have just canceled the ride, put my foot on the gas, and driven away. I even hovered my finger right over the cancel button on my screen. But for whatever reason, I did not press it. I unlocked the passenger doors, and he slid into the back seat without saying a single word. I regretted my decision the absolute second I took my foot off the brake. Most passengers will either scroll on their phones or stare out the window. But not this guy. He just sat there staring directly at me through the rearview mirror. He was not blinking. He was not looking away. He was just staring straight at me. I tried my best not to stare back, but I could not help but catch his eye in the mirror a couple of times. He looked incredibly angry, which was also pretty unsettling. I tried to ignore him and turned on the radio to break the silence. I do not even remember what station I clicked on, but the moment the music started playing, he snapped. He raised his voice and told me to turn it off. His voice was deep and raspy, and I could tell right away that he was a heavy smoker. His sudden outburst completely caught me off guard, and I actually gripped the steering wheel so hard that my hand slipped a little. I resisted the urge to look back at him in the mirror, and just did exactly as he asked. I shut the radio off and held the steering wheel tighter. We drove on in complete, suffocating silence. I was desperately hoping that he would just sit there quietly until we finally reached his destination. But then, out of nowhere, he spoke again. He leaned slightly forward and asked me if I had ever picked up someone I should not have. That question hit me like a brick. I felt my heart skip a beat, and I let out this nervous, awkward laugh. I tried to play it cool and told him that I certainly hoped not. I was trying to keep the mood light and casual, but he did not react at all. Instead, he just leaned back and muttered something to himself in a whisper that I could not hear. Then, he started going on about how he used to be an Uber driver himself. He said he had to quit because some punks had stolen a bunch of stuff from his car. He was slurring his words quite a bit, so it was hard to make out every single detail, but I got the general gist of his story. I looked up at the mirror once or twice while he was talking, and that was when I realized he was smiling the entire time. A normal person would not be smiling while talking about being robbed. And then, He concluded his story by saying it is funny how much trust you put in someone sitting right behind you. That comment was what did it for me. At that exact moment, I stopped thinking of him as just a crazy drug addict, and I started viewing him as an active physical threat. Unfortunately, there was not much I could do. I felt my pulse speed up, pounding in my ears. I kept my eyes on the road, but my mind was spinning. I kept glancing at the GPS, focusing on the destination like it was a lifeline, but the guy just would not stop talking. He kept babbling about nonsense. Some of it was deeply concerning, and some of it was just absolute gibberish. I honestly could not keep up with him. Eventually, his tone changed, and he started apologizing to someone, though I do not think he was talking to me. He began to insinuate that he had just done something truly awful, and that he was a bad person. He kept saying that he did not mean to do it, followed by a few frantic series. I chose not to respond at all, worried that any sound from me might trigger him to do something violent. I did not know what he had done or what he was capable of, and I was not about to find out. We were only a few minutes away from his destination when he suddenly snapped out of his muttering haze. He raised his voice and yelled at me, claiming that I had missed the turn. But the problem was, I had not missed any turn. The GPS clearly showed we were exactly on track, but out of sheer panic, I slammed on the brakes anyway. My hands were shaking violently at this point, and I just wanted this nightmare to be over. As soon as I shifted the car into park, a pair of headlights appeared behind us. It was a police cruiser, traveling slowly down the road. I said a silent prayer and watched through my mirrors as the police car crept closer, its bright spotlight briefly sweeping across my vehicle. The moment those lights hit us, the guy in my back seat instantly slouched down to hide. I turned my head and saw him lying almost perfectly flat across my back seat with his eyes closed. I quickly whipped my head back around before he could notice me, trying my best to keep my breathing steady. He stayed frozen in that position for a really uncomfortable amount of time, even after the police car passed. I wanted to ask him to leave, but decided against it. Eventually he lifted his head, looked at me, and told me that I had gotten lucky. Before I had a chance to react, he opened the door and disappeared. I immediately ended my shift right then and there. I was completely shaken up and did not feel like driving around anymore. It was not until a few weeks later, while scrolling through my phone, that I found out just how close to danger I had really been. According to a local news article, a convenience store had been violently robbed on the exact night I picked up that passenger, and the store was located just 2 blocks away from where I had picked him up. It makes me sick to my stomach to think that I was just inches away from a dangerous criminal, who could have easily harmed me if he had chosen to. I am still a little scared to contact the police about it, due to personal reasons, but I am definitely a lot more cautious about who I let into my car now. I used to live in the city. The busy, fast-paced urban lifestyle was honestly what I had always envisioned for myself. But after experiencing an extremely traumatic event, everything changed. I am not going to get into the specific details of that event, but the aftermath left me completely unable to tolerate even the smallest noises. I began to absolutely hate sound in general. My psychiatrist eventually told me that I had developed a rare and severe case of phonophobia. If you do not know what that feels like, imagine that uncomfortable pins and needles feeling you get when your foot falls asleep. It is kind of like that, but instead of your foot, you feel it deep inside your chest. It was always there, constant and heavy, like my body was permanently bracing itself for an impact that was never going to come. Every single car horn, every slamming door, and every loud conversation outside felt like a painful jolt straight to my nervous system. I quickly realized that I could not keep living my life that way, trapped in a constant state of panic. And so, about 3 years ago, I started searching for an escape. I eventually found a small cabin buried deep within the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest. I do not want to state the exact location of the cabin for reasons that you will soon understand, but all I will say is that it was somewhere in the state of Oregon. On paper, it seemed absolutely perfect. There were very few neighbors, absolutely no traffic, and barely any cell phone service. But what really sold me on the property was the complete and total lack of noise. It was just going to be me, surrounded by nothing but peace and quiet. For the first time in months, I actually allowed myself to believe that I might finally feel safe again. The cabin itself was quite small, but it was incredibly cozy and comfortable. To be completely fair, it was exactly what the real estate listing had promised me. You could easily tell that it had been built to last, with thick wooden beams supporting the ceiling and a sturdy rustic stone fireplace in the main living room. The air inside smelled like fresh pine and old, dusty books when I first walked through the door. It had that comforting, earthy scent that makes you feel instantly relaxed, similar to those old cabin-style bed and breakfasts you might stay at during a ski trip. The nearest neighbor lived about a 10-minute walk away, down a narrow, winding dirt path that cut through the thick trees. I did not go out of my way to meet her right away, though. For the first few days of my new life, I did nothing but soak in the absolute silence. I would wake up in the morning to the gentle sound of birds chirping instead of loud city sirens. At night, the only thing I could hear was the soft wind brushing through the tall trees. It felt like the entire world had pressed a giant pause button, and I could finally take a deep breath again. I did all of my freelance work on my laptop, so there was really no pressing need for me to connect with the outside world beyond that. But about a week after I officially moved in, there was a sudden knock at my front door. The cabin obviously did not have a doorbell, so those heavy wooden knocks were something I knew I would have to get used to. I opened the door, fully expecting it to be my neighbor, and I was right. Standing on my porch was a moderately old woman holding a small basket filled with homemade preserves. She looked like she had just stepped right out of a heartwarming Hallmark movie. She introduced herself to me as Michelle. She told me that she lived just about a 10-minute walk down the trail, which did not sound far at all until you actually factored in how incredibly dense these woods were. I mean, the forest was so thick that you could easily get turned around and completely lost in there, just trying to look for a bit of firewood. Michelle was in her late 60s, with oddly long, messy gray hair and these incredibly piercing blue eyes that made you feel like she was looking right through your soul. She was not necessarily rude, but she was definitely very blunt. She welcomed me to the woods and extended the basket of preserves toward me, looking like she fully expected me to take it right away. I did not really have much of a choice, as she was practically shoving the basket directly into my face. I know it sounds like a nice, hospitable gesture, but her overall vibe just felt a bit off to me. I grabbed the basket impulsively, but I have to admit that I had never been treated quite that way by a neighbor before. It was not anything crazy or aggressive, but it was definitely not what I was used to in terms of normal social interaction. I politely thanked her as I took the heavy basket from her hands, and she just stood there, looking at me like she was waiting for me to say something else. I honestly did not know what else to say, so I just stood there with an awkward smile on my face. She kept staring at me, which only confirmed my growing suspicion that this woman did not interact with other people very often. Finally, after a long silence, she spoke. She said to always keep your lanterns full, your windows shut tight, and your wits sharper than your axe. Those were her exact words, and I will never forget them. It was not the kind of thing a normal neighbor would say to someone who had just moved in. It felt less like friendly advice and much more like a serious warning. I simply nodded my head, smiled, and turned around to go back inside my cabin. After shutting the heavy door, I stood there in absolute silence, waiting to hear the sound of her footsteps walking away. But she did not move. She stood on my porch for a solid 45 seconds before finally walking away, which was probably the strangest part of the entire interaction. Despite the incredibly weird vibe she gave off, I did appreciate her gesture of kindness. She seemed like a reclusive, strange person, but not necessarily unfriendly. She felt like the type of neighbor who would help you out if you really asked for it, but would not go out of her way to pry into your personal business. I told myself that it was nice to at least know someone was living close by, even if I did not plan on ever needing her help. I did not even bother to look inside the basket she gave me. I just set it down on the living room table and completely forgot about it. That very night, a massive thunderstorm rolled in. Thunderstorms are actually extremely rare for this part of Oregon, but they do happen from time to time. I lit a few scented candles and curled up on the couch with a good book, trying my best to ignore the fact that the power was flickering on and off every few minutes. Some of you might find that kind of deep isolation in a dark cabin terrifying, but I actually loved it. For some reason, my phonophobia did not trigger with natural sounds like thunder. My brain was completely calm, and it was actually that specific storm that made me realize how much progress I was making. I listened closely to the rain, and it felt incredibly soothing. But of course, that peaceful feeling did not last. A few hours after the storm had started, a sudden knock at the door nearly made me jump straight out of my skin. I say it was a knock, but it was really more of a frantic, heavy banging. It was incredibly loud and definitely not a natural sound. It sounded like whoever was out there did not care at all that it was pouring rain. My heart immediately started pounding against my ribs, and I began to feel that god-awful tingly sensation of pins and needles creeping back into my chest. After hesitating in fear for a few seconds, I grabbed my flashlight, stood up, and went to check who could possibly be out there. I looked through the small glass window pane, right next to the door. It was Michelle. She was completely soaked to the bone, with rain dripping from her long hair, and she was clutching a flashlight of her own. I quickly unlocked and opened the door, but she began speaking before I could even say hello. She blurted out that she had just seen someone lurking near my wood pile, and she thought I should know about it. I was beyond confused by her sudden appearance, but her words were incredibly concerning, and that danger took immediate precedence over my confusion. I stepped out onto the wet porch, shining my flashlight beam into the heavy rain, but I could not see anything at all except for the dark trees. I turned back to her and asked if she was absolutely sure about what she saw, and she nodded her head rapidly. Her eyes kept darting back and forth toward the dark woods, like she was expecting someone to jump out of the shadows at any second. The whole situation was incredibly freaky. I kept scanning the area with my flashlight, but there was only darkness and the chaos of the storm. Before I could ask her any more questions, she told me to be careful, turned around, and began walking away without waiting for me to respond. I stood there and watched her walk back down the narrow path toward her own cabin, seemingly completely unfazed by the pouring rain. I stayed on the porch until the faint glow of her flashlight completely disappeared from sight, and then I went back inside. The literal second I shut the door and locked it, I realized that her story was absolutely riddled with logical holes. How could she have possibly seen someone near my woodpile if her own house was a 10-minute walk away? That meant she must have already been on my property in the first place. Why on earth would she be snooping around my cabin during a severe thunderstorm? Was she lying to me? It did not sit right with me at all, but marching over to her house in the middle of a massive storm was the last thing I wanted to do. Still, I had to do something. I locked up every window and door as securely as I could, and I sat in my bedroom, just listening to the darkness. The storm eventually started to die down, but I still felt incredibly uneasy. A few hours passed without any more strange incidents, so I decided that it was probably safe enough for me to try and get some sleep. I cannot remember the exact time, but sometime after midnight, I woke up to the distinct sound of a dry branch snapping just outside my bedroom window. I am a very light sleeper because of my condition, so I was 100% positive that it was a branch snapping, and not just the house settling. I froze in place under my blankets, listening intently. Eventually I crept out of bed and made my way over to the window, half hoping that I would not see anything. At first the yard looked empty, but then my eyes adjusted and I spotted her. It was Michelle. She was standing perfectly still at the very edge of the woods, her body angled away from my cabin. I could tell it was her because of her long, disheveled gray hair. I strained my eyes to see what she was doing, but there was only dim moonlight and it was hard to make out details. Suddenly, I saw her begin to turn her head toward my window. I quickly ducked down beneath the sill before she could catch me looking at her. I stayed crouched on the floor for what felt like forever. When I finally mustered up the courage to peek over the edge again, she was completely gone. I genuinely did not know what to do at that point. I had not originally thought of her as dangerous, just a bit eccentric, but now I was having serious second thoughts. It made absolutely no sense. Why would she come to my door to warn me about a prowler, if she was the one actively creeping around my property in the middle of the night? I could not sleep for the rest of the night. I was pretty dead set on just staying awake until the sun finally came up. A few more hours slowly ticked by, and I was starting to feel incredibly exhausted. Just as I finally began to let my guard down, thinking the danger had passed, There was another knock at my front door. It was not like the loud, aggressive banging from earlier. It was actually a very quiet, deliberate knock. Still, there was no way I was going to open that door under any circumstances. The pins and needles sensation flared up in my chest again as I quietly crept out of my room and made my way to the front door. I took a very careful, quiet glance through the glass window pane, and I froze in absolute horror. It was not Michelle. Standing on my porch was a massive, burly, bald man with a thick, bushy beard. I had to fight every single bone in my body to keep from screaming out loud in pure terror. The situation instantly went from a minor concern to a life-threatening emergency. As quietly as I possibly could, I retreated back into my bathroom, locked the door behind me, and dialed the police. While I was on the phone explaining the situation to the dispatcher, a sudden, violent banging started on the front door. It sounded like the man was repeatedly smashing his body or a heavy tool against the wood. The operator told me that help was on the way and instructed me to stay on the line and keep quiet. I sat on the bathroom floor, more terrified than I had ever been in my entire life. Eventually, the structural wood of the front door gave way, and I heard it crash open with a deafening splintering sound. I genuinely believed that my life was about to end. That man, whoever he was, stepped inside and began completely destroying everything in my cabin. At least, that is what it sounded like from my hiding spot. All I could hear was the terrifying sound of glass shattering and wood splintering in the living room. I did not dare to make even the slightest sound. Luckily for me, the man did not seem to search the rest of the cabin, because I never heard his heavy footsteps approach the bathroom. Eventually, the sounds of destruction stopped, and the cabin fell into complete silence once again. I had been fighting off a massive panic attack the entire time. To my absolute surprise, the police actually arrived relatively quickly, but they were still not fast enough to catch the intruder. He was long gone by the time they pulled up. I pleaded with the responding officers to help me and track the man down, but they were honestly pretty useless. They did a very quick, pathetic search of the immediate property around the cabin, but that was all. They refused to search the surrounding woods, claiming that the forest was far too dense, and that they would have almost zero chance of finding anyone in the dark. I begged them to at least walk with me to Michelle's house, which was just 10 minutes away. They reluctantly agreed to accompany me, but when we finally arrived at her property, my jaw literally dropped in disbelief. The cabin was completely abandoned. The roof was partially caved in, and the windows were all broken. The officers inspected the structure and confirmed that absolutely no one had lived there in decades. I insisted that they search the inside for squatters, but they told me there was no legal reason to do so, since there were no signs of recent habitation. They basically told me that living out in the deep woods came with inherent risks, and it was not their job to police empty forests. They left shortly after, which left me feeling incredibly frustrated and abandoned. I obviously packed up my things and moved out of that cabin, but I had to spend one more terrifying night there first. Luckily, nothing else happened that night. I am in a much safer place now, but I still think about that experience constantly. Some of my friends think Michelle was some kind of protective spirit, but I do not believe in the paranormal. I think it is much more likely that she and that man were squatters living in that abandoned house together. I just do not understand why they targeted me, or why Michelle warned me. I guess I will never know. My name is Luke. My girlfriend Catherine and I met 3 years ago as freshmen at Stanford. Since she is from Cincinnati and I am from just outside Columbus, Ohio, we share an incredibly deep bond over our Midwestern roots. One of our favorite holiday traditions is driving through the night on Christmas Eve from my parents' house in Columbus all the way to her house in Cincinnati, so we can spend Christmas Day with her family. That late-night drive on secluded back roads with our favorite music playing has always been our special, peaceful escape. But this past Christmas Eve, that peaceful escape turned into a living nightmare. It was just after midnight when we finally hit the road. The snow was falling lightly, and we were completely alone on the dark back roads. Suddenly, my phone rang from an unknown number. I ignored it, but it rang a second time. I let it go to voicemail again, laughing it off as a persistent holiday scam call. But when it rang a third time, I snapped. I picked it up, ready to yell, but was met with creepy static silence. Then a deep, slow voice spoke. "Hello, Luke. I felt my stomach drop as the voice began reciting highly personal details about my life, my name, and my address. I asked what he wanted, and his reply made my blood run cold. He said he was not there for me, he was there for Catherine. He chuckled and said, "She is sitting right next to you." In a panic, I slammed on the brakes and pulled over. Suddenly, Catherine snatched my phone and hung up the call. I screamed in her face, asking why she did that, but she just stared at me with wide, tearful eyes. I tried to redial the number back multiple times, but it was completely disconnected. The rest of the long drive was spent in a heavy, paranoid silence. Catherine still swears she has absolutely no idea who that caller was, but I cannot shake the terrifying feeling that she is hiding something from me, and that he will call again very soon, and I do not know what I will do. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.